Good evening and welcome to Equity at Work, a webinar series presented by Associated Black Charities. My name is Chrissy Thornton. I am your president and CEO, and we're so happy that you have joined us this evening. Our presentation will begin shortly. Thank you. Good evening and welcome again to Equity at Work, a webinar series presented by Associated Black Charities. My name is Chrissy Thornton and I'm the president and CEO of Associated Black Charities, or ABC, a 38-year-old community organization. We work as an educator, an advocate, a supporter, and a convener to eliminate race-based structural barriers and to advance long-term solutions that create new opportunities for African Americans to thrive. We envision at ABC a world that prioritizes measurable change in the life of African Americans and works actively toward the elimination of racial disparities, resulting in improved outcomes for all. Thank you for joining us this evening for Equity at Work, a webinar series where tonight's topic is Confronting the Angry Black Woman Stereotype. I'm going to ask my panelists to join us on screen at this time. We are so excited to explore this topic. Last year, the Harvard Business Review wrote that the angry Black woman stereotype has penetrated many parts of American culture, including the workplace. This pervasive stereotype not only characterizes Black women as more hostile, aggressive, overbearing, illogical, ill-tempered, and bitter, but it may also be holding them back from realizing their full potential in the workplace and shaping their work experiences overall. Tonight, we want to discuss and dismantle the barriers this stereotype creates and its implications on workplace safety and equality for Black women. And I have a group of powerhouse dynamic women, female Black women panelists with me tonight joining this webinar. And I'd like to give each of them the opportunity to not only introduce themselves, but to share why this discussion around the angry Black woman trope is important to them and why they are participating in tonight's conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Tawana Bhagwat. Tawana?
Good evening, and thank you for having me here tonight, Chrissy. My name is Tawana Bhagwat. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I identify as a Black woman. Today, I am here as the CEO and principal consultant for organization at its best. I've been in corporate America for over 20 years before starting my own business. And I also sit as the current board chair of ABC and I'm so excited about this topic tonight. This topic is important to discuss openly because the angry Black woman label has been weaponized and has caused so much harm, trauma, and damage to Black women, and particularly in corporate America. And this has been a long time coming for an open conversation. So I'm super excited to join the other panelists as we have this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Elizabeth Leiba.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. This feels really good. It's been a little bit of a strange last few days. So I'm glad to be in this space to just be able to discuss some of the concerns about this trope, the angry Black woman, and what that really does for women in corporate spaces and beyond. My primary work has always been in higher education. So I'm a 20-year veteran of higher education. I've worked everything from admissions to faculty to now work in the corporate offices of my organization as a director in instructional design and innovation. And a part of why I'm so passionate about educating about Black history and culture, and specifically speaking to Black women about our role, is that the Black woman really, when we think about the narrative, Zora Neale Hurston talked about this idea of being the mule of the earth. And a lot of the time we're bearing the burden of the whole Black community. And I'm not speaking in hyperbole. This is just statistically speaking that Black women really have been the most disadvantaged and have been the most educated and have been the most impactful on the front lines of a lot of the civil rights movement, but have not necessarily been able to get the advantages or benefits of some of the work that we've actually put into getting change made in America. And I think right now it's very critical that we understand that the narrative that we are being fed and a lot of the things that are being taken for granted, such as police brutality or systems of inequity, the narrative is wrong. So we really have to take a lot of time to dismantle these stories and use our own voices to correct misinformation, because those that are making up the stories, right? The victor always makes up the history and the story. And if we leave it to other people to tell our story, we won't be able to really leverage our own voices and put the accurate information out there. So that's what I'm hoping to do with everyone tonight. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Charnell.
Thank you so much for having me. This is, excuse me, such an exciting evening. My name is Charnell Covert. My pronouns are she, her, and goddess. And I come to this work as someone who is an advocate, a community organizer. I'm very grateful to be a part of the Associated Black Charities family as a program manager and strategist doing the super important work of racial equity and racial justice in Baltimore, Maryland, and abroad. Also, like Elizabeth, I'm also an educator. I've been a professor for 11 years, and my work has always centered around Black women, girls, and femmes, as I am a proud Black woman, femme, and very interested in all the ways that Black women show up for ourselves outside of the negative stereotypes that have put before us. So we're talking about the angry Black woman tonight. There's also the Sapphire and the Mammy and the Jezebel that have long and historically haunted the perception of Black women in mass media, literature, and in popular culture, as well as in social policies. For me, when we think about dismantling the angry Black woman, the reason why this conversation is important to me today and always is because it's not just the stereotypical vision of a myopic Black woman that clouds our judgment, but this is also the policies that get written in our laws about Black women and Black communities and families. These are also the curriculum that gets written about Black women in schools and in safe spaces that we normally, as Elizabeth noted, lead and often don't get the credit for. And I guess another thing that helps me to think about this conversation and this import today is what the illustrious ancestor Toni Morrison stated, which is that definitions are not for the defined, but they are for the definers. We have to flip that narrative on its head, as Toni Morrison talked about in her essay on playing whiteness in the literary imagination. She stated that Black women writers, scholars, anthropologists, activists, advocates have always had a long history of framing for ourselves who we are outside of white supremacy, capitalism, and other forms of hegemony. So I think I'm thrilled to be in such great company to really have this conversation at this particular time in history, which is quite important.
Thank you so much. We're going to ask our viewers tonight to be engaged and participatory. If you can, drop your comments into the chat. We'll be taking Q&A, so use the Q&A as part of the platform to drop your questions in of our panelists. And we're going to get to the discussion. And so I wanted to start off with just some facts about how Black women show up in the workplace so that we can have some context before we delve into the topic of the angry Black woman stereotype. And so obviously Black women face the challenges that come at the intersection of both race and gender in the workplace. But it's important to note that while Black women make up nearly 7% of the workforce, we are still severely underrepresented in leadership positions, obviously. Our unemployment rate is much higher compared to white women. And we have, throughout the pandemic, been disproportionately impacted with layoffs and job eliminations throughout COVID and the period of time that low-paying service sector jobs were hardest hit during that time. And among people with advanced degrees, and this is one that always interests me the most, Black women, who we know to be the most educated demographic, earn 70% of what white men do. And in fact, Black women, with advanced degrees have weekly earnings less than white men with only bachelor's degrees. Black women earn about 63 cents for every dollar earned by the white man. And so all of these things are true. All of these things are facts. This is before we even get to the difficulties of dealing with obstacles presented by a stereotype. What do you think about some of these facts, and how do they factor into how you all have navigated the workplace in your careers, and what you think about just equity in the workplace for Black women in general? Tawana?
So I am constantly answering this question, right? I'm navigating it for myself. I'm helping others to navigate it as they are experiencing it in real time. I'm also spending a lot of time helping women heal from their experiences of these stereotypes. And I would love to say that I've done some healing, so I'm in a good place to help others move through it. And then I hear new stories, right? And it reminds me that I still have some work to do. So when I hear these statistics as you shared them, they are real, right? They are real. And I don't believe enough of us know the actual facts of them. We can only speak from them from our trauma or the experience that we have, and then get the question asked often: when is enough enough?
Absolutely.
When does it stop? When will I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
When will we be able to have conversations to help people understand that without us taking our rightful positions, the whole world is at risk of lack of innovation, productivity, movement, growth? And so I'm hoping to further this conversation as a way of empowering.
That is so important. One of the viewers has said that every job she's ever had, she's known herself to be triple qualified over her white counterparts. And we're talking about, as Black women, learning to negotiate for these specific statistical reasons. And so this is a lived experience of Black women in the world of work. And now we add to that the weight of the angry Black woman stereotype, which I'm assuming that some people may not have known to be a real thing, right? We talk about it, it's referenced loosely, but many of our viewers and participants and allies may not have really known the impact of that stereotype. And I just wanted to share that it is believed have been originated in the 1950s. Obviously, these stereotypes and tropes date back to slavery, and we know the tie-in from that time. This particular stereotype is believed to stem from the 1950s radio show Amos and Andy, where Black women were depicted as sassy and overbearing and domineering. What do you all have, or what do you think about the origination of the stereotype? Where do you think it was born and birthed, and why has it had such a long-standing trajectory in the world of work? Charnell?
Yeah, so when we think about media and literature, these are two wheelhouses that I spend a lot of time interrogating. And I think sometimes folks, even in academia, as well as in community organizing spaces, might lead you to believe that looking at and studying media and literature is frivolous or not as serious as other academic disciplines, but I totally disagree. If we look at the film Birth of a Nation that was shown, done by D.W. Griffin in the White House, the first film shown in the White House. And this is a film that talks about Reconstruction from a pro-Ku Klux Klan white supremacist perspective. And in this film, we see images of white men in blackface projecting what they believe primarily Black men, and in some cases Black women, to be barbaric, criminal, savage, etc. Now, why is that important? In the media imagination of Americans, this is what some people who may never see a Black person perceived at that time when Birth of a Nation in 1914 was proliferated to be true about Black people. This is entirely true when it comes to Black women, right? If you didn't grow up in the best city in the world, I call it Baltimore City, aka Tubman City, where you're surrounded by beautiful Black and brown people on a regular basis, and the majority of the city is Black. You might have grown up in a small town in Idaho, right, where the majority of folks around you are white and have never met a Black woman. So what you see in media, or what you read in text or on social media, even in this contemporary context, is what sticks. So when we see images, I'm just going to give you all a popular culture example, images like Tasha from the popular Tyler Perry series, Why Did I Get Married, who is extremely angry, very quote unquote ghetto, is loud, is always sort of intimidating her husband and her partner, never letting him speak, always taking up too much space. These images become the foundation of what people think about Black womanhood. And to take it a step further in terms of historicity, right? When we think about the way that Black women have been portrayed in chattel slavery, our primary role was that of breeders. And so when we were thought to be the breeders, that was our function. There was nothing beyond that. When we tried to form ourselves outside of the foundation of slavery into Reconstruction, post-slavery, et cetera, there was a big tension on what is the role of Black women and how is that different from the feminine role of white womanhood that we see. So white women have always thought to be fragile and beautiful, right? And they've always been able to hold the space of femininity, whereas Black women, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, have always been seen as the mules, the workers, right? There's so much data that I could give, but just thinking about some of the work in sociology that speaks to how Black women during Reconstruction were working the same type of jobs that Black men were working post-war. We've never had the privilege in the same way that white women have had in terms of docile employment. We've always worked outside the home or raised other people's children. When you look at domestics in the South, that was the major form of labor for Black women. And so this idea of being angry at work is strangely American in some ways, and is deeply harmful to how Black women have showed up, not just for themselves, but for their families. And if you were perceived as being angry at work as a domestic historically, that could be the end of your job and the end of your livelihood, but not just the livelihood of yourself, but might be the livelihood of your entire community. We have to think about in these gender dynamics as well, Black men being feared as the Black male rapist and the Black male criminal might not have been hired to work in these domestic roles in the same way that Black women were. And so many ways, the income of Black women has historically been foundation for sustaining Black families. And so it's really, there's a lot to say about it, but I just wanted to bring that sort of history and contemporary piece. It's not just this benign, oh my goodness, Tasha on Why Did I Get Married is so funny because she's so angry and she's so ghetto. This is a storied presentation of Black women not being able to be fully feminine in the same way that we see white women or other groups of women, and that therefore making us not truly women. And so we've had to really reclaim and redefine for us, what does it mean to be a woman? Because if we're not using the standard of white fragility as our femininity standard, what does it mean for us to be Black women?
Oh, that is so on point. Elizabeth, I'd love to hear from you, but I want to add that the image of the angry Black woman historically has been used to silence and shame Black women who dare to challenge social inequities, to complain at all about their circumstances, or who stand in demand for fair treatment. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, Charnell really just gave a textbook explanation of why narrative and storytelling is so important, because whoever's telling the story is framing that story. And for Black folk in America, if you think about the idea that it was against the law for us to even learn how to read, then you can see why it would be to the benefit of someone that literally owned you as property to frame a story once you are not their property anymore and they wanted to control you. So a lot of what we're navigating when we think about the narrative of Black folk in general is a narrative that is fictional. We're all basically players in a play that has been written about us and for us to star in, and we are like, get the director over here. This is not me, but they won't rewrite the play. They don't want to go back in the writing room and make it accurate. They're like, no, this is what you're going to acting. And a lot of us, we know that those stereotypes don't fit us. They're not anything that is even familiar. It really is a trope that has been created as a way of controlling just the way that we function in society. There's so many tropes that speak to the things that Black women have to navigate. I see sometimes this idea of Black women as like angry or a single mom or even the Jezebel and all these different tropes. These tropes literally are supposed to strip us of our humanity. They're supposed to emasculate our men. There are a lot of things that were done intentionally, because if you think about the whole idea of even minstrel shows and how there was a portray, there was really, and this all goes really back to this idea of defining Blackness and defining whiteness. If you have a goal in mind where you want to distinguish yourself as separate, it makes sense to create a stereotype of, or an anti-type of what you are. And then that stereotype becomes, for us, the sassy, the over-sexualized, the loud, the aggressive, because that's in direct contrast to white womanhood. And as Charnell said, from a historical perspective, if you're seen as a breeder, then it makes sense to over-sexualize that person. It's the same thing we see when women are sexually assaulted. The first thing the person says is, well, what was that person wearing? As if that has something to do with it. So in order to victim blame, shame, create a dynamic where Black women literally are almost seen in the same vein as a man, it really does connect to today. We know that the stat that you cited as far as Black women not that are highly educated, not even making the same as, a white male that has less education. We know from the stats that we have about criminal justice that and law enforcement that Black women are stopped just as often or even more than white men. And when you're talking about police and traffic stops, right? Getting pulled over and searched. I myself have been false arrested. I had a false arrest at the age of 19 and I was a college student. It's very common for Black youth to be adultified and Black women to be adultified even in K through 12, where they're seeing the principal more often, they're getting written up more often, they're getting suspended more often, expelled more often, because that adultification allows that person that's objectifying you. We have that misogynoir of, oh, you're not really a woman, you're there's just a literal imaginary character that has become, this is what a Black woman is. And I think that really deals with the heart of why Black women are struggling in the workplace, because there is a caricature that is being put forward of who we really are. And it's in direct contrast to really how we see ourselves. And it really has become almost like a character that we're battling, not even our real selves when we go into these spaces, because we can be totally normal, speaking in a regular tone, not doing anything, and the person thinks that we're angry, or they're asking what's wrong, and you literally almost like doing a double take, because you know that nothing is wrong, but that person already has that. And that's why what Charnell says makes a lot of sense, in that media and narratives and stories permeate. If you think about just repeating something over and over again, we saw that with January 6th, we see that with everything on the news coverage. If people repeat something over and over again enough, for some reason, this is a psychological aspect of that, where people just start to believe it. And people that have done this and repeated these tropes and stereotypes have done this over the course of hundreds of years. So these stereotypes are very embedded in the psyche of not only us, but those in the majority as well.
Absolutely. And we've reviewed the historical context, the origins of the stereotype. And you may have some people who say, okay, that was historical. We've identified that it's been deeply rooted in white supremacy and as a mechanism of control. But how does this stereotype show up in today's workplace? How does it impact Black women trying to navigate today's workplace? Emotions happen at work, frustration happens at work. How does this angry Black woman stereotype just in real time affect women in today's workplace?
I'll jump in. I was doing a training today that spoke to disparities and equities in the workplace, and actually training on HR role, right? And helping those that are in leadership to understand that they have a role, right? And they can no longer turn a blind eye when there are people in your organization that are experiencing things like being labeled, which in turn translates to not being given an opportunity to bring their authentic self, because it's already been defined for them. And they spend all day reframing, repositioning, right? So that they don't get this label, because then the work becomes convincing and undoing something that was never theirs or who they were to begin with. So as we talk from how that shows up and impacts women in the workplace, to have an experience that's very similar to their white counterparts, women in particular, who demand, right, to be treated a certain way, to be positioned, to be promoted, to be, next in
Protected,
right,
I
to
would
be
say, right?
protected. Never ever being called or labeled as angry, right? But use the very appropriate words around emotional, because there's a disappointment or a letdown. But to then in turn have that same emotion expressed and to be called angry, right? To now need coaching or some intervention that will have you to get back in line, right? So to then translate that to, I no longer feel safe here, which is really a validating point, right? We have to have those pivotal moments that remind us that that space wasn't ours to be safe in to begin with, but we step into them and try it out. We step into them with wishful thinking and hopefulness that this situation or scenario will be different, only to be reminded of our place and not have support to navigate through how to have some protection or some safety to be able to correct wrongs. And so today, as I was speaking to predominantly all white HR leaders that are responsible for ensuring the safety of all, but in particularly people of color and Black women in general, they were literally in awe of, I would never think that we would feel that to be labeled. I was like, no, it's actually a microaggression.
Yeah.
Right. So let me give you the name to call it. So now we can work through that there's an invalidation, there's an assault and an insult on a person's character that they now have to spend time. So as we talk about how it shows up in the workplace, it's so many layers. And on top of that, there are actors that are roles are in place to keep that narrative alive, because it lays a foundation to keep you out of position, away from access and opportunity.
Oh my goodness, I love that. And so what you're saying is that emotions aren't disallowed at work, because some emotions are expected and maybe even preferential. I shared in the promotional material for this webinar that in one instance for me in the workplace, I was asked why I couldn't or didn't show up a little bit more like a colleague who was, I felt in my estimation, who presented weaker, who presented more tentative, who presented a little bit more docile. I mean, even the tone of her voice I felt was, you know, in a higher placement, and it was meek and these things. And I was actually asked, and she was a Black woman, and I was actually asked why I could not show up a little bit more like her, because she made people feel more comfortable than I did. And then as a Black woman looking at her, I actually resented her and was disappointed in her for showing up that way. And so it sounds like from what you said that emotions are okay, but specifically being women, we're expected to present in weakness. And when we don't, as Black women, we're certainly angry. Charnell or Elizabeth, you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely, thank you, Tawana, for that insight. Surely the folks who were a part of your training got some good information today. I wanted to bring up a couple of examples from popular culture to sort of elucidate the point that I want to make here. Thinking about recently in a Black woman in her place of work, Megan Thee Stallion, and the case with she and Tory Lanez, right? If you followed what had been happening, so for those of you who might not know, Megan was shot by Tory. He's now been found guilty. All of that has sort of come to a bit of a finish. But in the years since this happened, because this happened a couple of years ago, Megan had been so poorly, deeply, and horrifically trolled on social media. The popular opinion, if the court of popular opinion is a thing, which I believe it certainly is, was that she, in fact, as a Black woman, and a particular type of Black woman, a Black woman who is tall, who is beautiful, who owns her sexuality, who takes up space, who is unapologetic about her political views on reproductive justice, etc., on sexuality, queerness, Black femininity. She was already, by the court of public opinion, had to have done something to have provoked her own harm by this person. So I think that when we think about someone like Megan, who has fame and money, and you know, a lot of young women look up to Megan Thee Stallion, the hot girls and the hot boys, etc. But when we look at someone like her, who is not exempt from how the angry Black woman feels in your workplace, her literal safety was put at harm. And even when she was the most vulnerable on Gayle King and crying about the incident and saying how afraid she was for her life, people still disbelieved her. People still felt like she was the one. While she was the victim, people still felt like she was the antagonist, right? Simply because she's a Black woman who owns her agency and takes up space. And for me, embedded in the angry Black woman is, it's not just about your emotions, but it's about the way you take up space. It's about how you enter a room. It's about the fact that you're unapologetic about your Blackness, your womanness, your femininity, your sexuality. That is threatening not just the people individually, but that is threatening to a system of structural violence, such as white patriarchy, capitalism, etc. That literal representation is a form of resistance. I think about Michelle Obama, right? One of the most well-known Black women in the world. And if you think about her texts on becoming, all of the examples in different parts of her life where she did not get the mentorship that she deserved as an exceptional young Black woman, simply because of the perception by her, again, her aesthetics, being tall, being dark skinned, right? The fact that she was articulate, which is code word for that you talk too much or you take up too much space. It is certainly, if we want to call that a microaggression, I tend to not use the word microaggression only because I like to call a thing. And I feel like when I say micro, it makes it little. And there's nothing small about racism or misogynoir. So I just call it what it is. So what Michelle Obama was experiencing through this book in different instances, from the time that her roommate didn't want to stay with her at her dorm at her undergraduate institution, right, to examples where in these high-powered law firms, she didn't have the mentorship that her other white male colleagues had, which, as we know, there have been studies that show that mentorship and social capital are the real things that help people get access to power, elevation, and promotion. So if Black women are perceived as angry and are perceived as taking up too much space and are perceived as not being able to be worked with, unworkable, then we don't get the mentors that get us those individual recommendations to the high power positions as presidents in Fortune 500 or CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, working in think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, thinking of someone like Serena Williams, again, who was at the top of her game in terms of her field. And even with all of the prestige, money, and very much knowing her body as a top tier athlete, we see how the convergence of racism, sexism, and general anti-Blackness in American society came to head in the birth of her child and what she was experiencing in the labor and delivery room, that she was not even listened to because the perception is that she is too emotional. And that in fact, as Black women, we don't have the right to have access to emotions. When I think about George C. Wolfe in the Colored Museum, he talks about emotionality and Black people. There's a scene he has in the play where he talks about Black folks going insane as a reclaiming of being able to hold all emotions. In other words, because of chattel slavery, because of Jim Crow, because of the prison industrial complex and all these other structural systems, we've never been able to fully delve into our emotional intelligence. But to be truly human is to feel a full range of emotions, including anger, including at moments what looks to be insanity, including depression, including sadness, including anxiety. I could go on and on and on. So when we strip a particular group, such as Black women, and I just named 3 popular examples, but we can look at that in any space of work. I'll give one more, which is myself. When I was just starting out as a professor at CUNY, City University of New York, and I was teaching Black studies, I had one student who was an Italian young man. He was younger than me, getting his degree. And I showed the Black Power mixtape because we were talking about the influence of the Black Panther Party on social policy and social institutions such as the free lunch program that was engineered by the Black Panthers. So I wanted to give them some facts and show it in a visual way. And this young man then decided to say, you know, this is propaganda. This is Black propaganda. I'm not watching this. And you should be ashamed of yourself. Essentially was berating me in my classroom, right? Or in the classroom that I was charged to facilitate, because I do believe in shared education. And so I've kind of let him get it out. And then I going to continue the film. And if you have any further critique of it, I want you to go back to the text that we read that talks about whiteness as a permission to not accept images of Black excellence, images of Black progress, and that sort of coming from your place of privilege. I want you to interrogate that, right? Of course, he didn't like that, but I always brought it back to the nature of the class. He then proceeded to go to my chair to say, I think this person should be fired. She's angry. She snapped at me, right? Other students in the class did not have the same experience, but this was his perception of me essentially clapping back at him in a very
Back at him.
intellectual way,
Yes.
that you're not going to do this in this classroom space and make myself and other students feel intimidated because of your lack of ability to acknowledge your white privilege and how you're seeing these Black people in radical spaces.
So I love that point because, and I want to make sure we ask around and interested in Liz's thoughts too, is the angry Black woman stereotype a scapegoat? Is it an excuse, that is very easily, pointed to when we don't like how Black women show up, when we disagree with what they put forward? And it's just very easy because accuse them of being angry or being emotionally uncontrollable or being ill-tempered. Is it just an easy out that takes the shift, shifts the focus from, thoughts and treatment that isn't consistent with equity?
One quick point I wanted to say was that how that ended is that this person went to my Black woman chair and was expecting me to be reprimanded or get a rap on the wrist or maybe lose my job. And what he saw was a Black woman stand in solidarity.
Solidarity.
I don't know what you're referring to, but Professor Covert has always held her class in a very professional way. And so maybe you need to, and kind of gave him the same thing. So, and bringing all that up too with stature and even space. I'm 6 feet, I'm dark skinned, I'm curvy. So my mere presence is perceived as being angry long before I can open my mouth.
That is a huge point to add to this conversation. Because like we said earlier, you walk in and you already are the angry Black woman before you even assert yourself or have any opinions about anything. Mm-hmm. Liz, what do you think about using the trope as an easy out to take the focus off of bad behavior and inequity?
Yeah, because it's not true. So I think a stereotype or a trope, it always becomes this thing that you can lean on because it's just like, I don't even know, when we were growing up, like in the hood or whatever, you already know if you're going to say something to somebody to get them, ticked off. You might say they got roaches in their house. You might say something about their mama. It's like people have their go-to things that they know are triggering. And I think for us as Black women, when we go into spaces, people, I think a lot of it, somebody put in the chat about this idea of jealousy. If we think about it from a historical perspective, Black women have always been needed to be quote unquote controlled. Because if you think about just our agency, we did not have agency over our own bodies. We did not belong to our husbands. Our marriages were not even recognized. We were literally, and Charnell already alluded to this, we were breeding machines. If you think about the idea that enslaved Africans, this was like cattle. This is like a piece of property, like a mule or a horse or, a plow. So you're trying to control the narrative for someone that they don't want to be controlled. We didn't just willingly go, we fought people. We just looked at Black Panther, and I say this all the time, that my favorite line is how he said, throw me in the ocean, like, my ancestors that preferred death over bondage. But that really was happening. And we know that historically, Black folk did not want to be in slavery. That's why there were all these uprisings throughout the Caribbean and the United States, because breaking tools and trying not to be oppressed and trying not to be enslaved. I think there's a narrative that says like Black folk willingly just walked into slavery because like we didn't have any other options. It's like, no, we came from a land, a continent full of resources, and that the whole transatlantic slavery literally changed the course of history for the African diaspora. So it would be in the best interest of whoever's creating that narrative to create a narrative that you would lean into that would control who you were as an individual and make sure it stripped you of your identity. And a part of that has been the idea of, okay, if I don't own you now, what can I do to control the narrative around you that makes it distasteful for me to want to be around you or for people to want to work with you. So if you're going to create a narrative that someone is sassy, they don't listen, they're always talking, like if I said that, hey, you want to hire my friend, they're sassy, loud, annoying, you don't listen, they don't take direction, they're always, you would be like, I don't want that
I don't want
resume,
that
keep
person.
that, right? I
Right.
don't want that person. So it makes a lot of sense for them to create a narrative about a Black woman because they have always wanted to control Black women. Even our natural hair, if you think about these quote unquote microaggressions, and I don't believe micro is really a good, we say death by 1,000 paper cuts for a reason, because of the fact that a lot of these assaults on us are really not micro. But if you think about the idea that even from a historical perspective, these laws, these Tenon laws during slavery times, during enslavement, where Black women even had to wear their hair covered, because it's like your hair is a distraction to my husband, not keeping in mind that the husband is in the quarters and has like 10 children with this woman, this person that's enslaved. Even the narratives of Sally Hemings and saying, oh, an affair with Thomas Jefferson. How does a 14-year-old have an affair with a 40-year-old man? These narratives that have been created to make Black women seem overly sexualized, not able to take direction, not able to control themselves, overly emotional. But if someone of our counterparts from the majority culture is doing those same things, there's tissues to wipe the tears and everything else. And I always say that Black women's tears don't seem to move the majority, because our tears just seem to be like, who cares if you're emotional? Who cares if you're hurt? And I think that is a part of a greater intentional story, which is meant to harm us, which means that we can bear anything. If you're going to say it's legal to rape someone, have 15 children with someone, which was the number that many people, these masters ascribed to a woman, that she had to have at least 15 children, you're not going to want that person to be docile and calm and gentle and worthy of protection. You want to say that person's like a brute. She's like a man. She's aggressive. She's angry. She's sassy. She's overly sexualized. She wants it. She loves it, because then you're doing these things to her and you can justify that, which is really, if the more I think about it, it's repulsive. This idea that we have to even be subjected to something that literally is supposed to strip us of any right to say no to somebody. And that's really what I think it boils down to. It boils down to this need and desire to not let us have the ability to raise our voices. And a lot of us, when we go into these spaces, we spend so much time walking on eggshells, this whole idea of double consciousness and seeing ourselves as two separate people, the one that we have to present to the outside world. And like that incident that you said happened, Chrissy, where the person was being more gentle and docile, and it made you resent that. A lot of us have that resentment of ourselves, because we split ourselves into our normal self that we have at home with our friends, with our family, with the people at church, people at our sorority, people that we went to school with. And then we have this docile person that we know is more acceptable. And imagine that. I mean, if you think about the mental health struggle, the anxiety, depression, all the different, just everything that's going through your head when you know you're not complete. When people say code switching, oh, that's just being professional. I'm like, I have been a college professor. I know what it means to adjust to your audience. That is not what this is. When you're code switching or you're not bringing your authentic self, you can't tap into imagination. You can't tap into innovation. You can't tap into your source of who you really are and use that to propel you forward. So it would be in the best interest of somebody to give you a narrative that's completely opposite of who you really are, because then it stifles you. You're not going to want to go ask for the promotion. You're not going to want to battle with Brad and Chad that seem to just be walking on water when they're mediocre, and you know that you're excellent. Because if you're walking on water and excellent, then you're going to have to compete with them. And Charnell said it earlier. Toni Morrison said this: "Who are you if you don't have your racism to lean on? Who are you if you have to be standing up and I'm on my knees? Who does that? There you are, strung out. You're looking in the mirror, and all you have is yourself." And I think for a lot of them, someone said it in the chat earlier, it is a certain amount of jealousy. There's a certain amount of intimidation. There is a certain amount of Black women have always showed up into every space, and we are demographically speaking, the most educated. We have degrees upon degrees upon degrees. We work twice as hard. We do all the things our parents told us to do. So it would make sense that somebody's mediocre, that got recommended by their uncle and knows that they don't have as much education as we are, would try to spin a story that makes us seem as though we don't know what we don't have the capability to do what we're supposed to do in those spaces. And I think a lot of it is just really just like that low hanging, and I don't even want to say low hanging fruit. And that's just how awful it is to have all these things in your brain that are spinning around. And we have to deal with that every day. This idea that all these narratives and all these stories, we have to pick through to find that accurate story that actually represents our own experience. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. So what we do know is that the angry Black woman stereotype finds itself in the workplace, working into Black women's performance evaluations, their opportunities for advancement and leadership. It can be the impetus for misunderstandings around our willing to collaborate and to work well in team environments. And all of these things are affecting Black women today at every level of the workforce. But I have a question I would like you all to ponder and contribute to. And the question is, are Black women angry? And if so, do they have a right to be? And I'll start as you all just come off mute when you're ready to contribute, to say that if I was to answer that question based on my experiences as a now 47-year-old woman who has navigated the workforce throughout, the duration of my career, there are several instances, experiences, times, spaces, situations that have made me so very angry in the workplace. So very unseen, undervalued, underappreciated, used, abused, and I've been angry, right? And not to contribute to the stereotype, but in many of my experiences, I feel validated in frustration and anger based on my lived experience. So I ask you again, are Black women angry? And if so, do they have a right to be? Tawana.
Absolutely, Black women are angry, and 110% they have a right to be. And as I say that to you, having been labeled on many occasions as an angry Black woman who comes to a space very much confident, shored up in who I am, educated 3 times as much as, my white counterparts, men, you name it. But I would tell you that the anger source for me, in my experience, lives on 2 folds. The first is that I'm exhausted from having to navigate, assimilate, reposition, shrink, play small. And as a result of that, I'm conscious that I'm doing it because that was the formula that was given to me by those who came before me. And whenever I was inspired to not live up to that formula, I was also angry with myself for not having enough to say, no, I won't subscribe to this formula because it doesn't work for me. Therefore, pulling myself out of alignment, head and heart, out of alignment constantly. And I chose to stay. I learned this early in my 22-year career in corporate before doing it on my own. Those first 5 years, I would say I had to grow up. And then I got okay with whatever the consequences were. And I became fearless in my stance. But at the same time, I delivered the hell out of whatever was given to me so that they would have to think twice about how they would handle me. So to them, in their eyes, as I speak to you very confidently and directly, I was a threat. So now I lean on that disposition. But as you well know, I'm still out of alignment, because who want to have that harsh, brute
All the time, right?
all the time. So I'm trying to find my way in the midst of, I won't subscribe to this, but this is what I resolved to. And that still doesn't feel natural, normal in my being. So as I'm navigating in my justification to be angry or to just be, I also had the flip side of that, of those who coached me. I was angry with them because they looked like me. And not because I believed that they were trying to harm me. They were given the formula and it got them to high places. So just follow this lead and you'll have these things too, or you'll reach the promised land. And my response to that was, don't train another Black woman to accept this label, because now harm is being perpetuated in our own community. So I don't have a safe place either way.
Wow.
That didn't feel good. So I, Tawana, have been healing from that journey. So as I sit here today, to be able to do it my way on my terms, my coaching is not on my watch. Not
Wow,
on my watch would I give that formula.
that is amazing. That is amazing. We know there are consequences either way. I mentioned earlier, there are two ways to approach this. You either show up authentically and face the consequences, or you conform, you shrink, you dim your light to assimilate and still face the consequences. So in some ways, it's a no-win situation for Black women in the workplace. But Liz or Charnell, are Black women angry? Do they have a right to be? And then any advice quickly to navigate the choice between authentic, shrinking, knowing there's not a win in sight?
I'm reminded of Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls Who Consider Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, Lady in Green, in her monologue where she says, somebody has ran off of all of my stuff. And in this monologue, Lady in Green is talking about the way she is elucidating to personal items, her plants, a pair of her underwear that she really liked, a key that she left outside under the mat. But what she's really talking about in this monologue as a Black woman is the ways in which the society takes away and strips us of our ability to be our authentic selves. And that part of us, the best parts of ourselves, is us. And yet we are challenged, like the Lady in Green talked about, that what I have is valuable to me before it's even of any value to you, right? The voice that I have is important to me before it even means something to you. I often hear people in this self-help realm related to Black women and women of color saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't help anybody if you don't help yourself. You have to put your mask on first before you save someone else. But what's missing for me in that dialogue is, why is it even in the rhetoric of self-help that Black women still have to be servants? Why is it that the first space that we find healing for us can't just be for us? Like, what if I just want to be well for me? Not that it always has to be for my partner, not that it always has to be for my children, not that it always has to be for my community. So are Black women angry? Absolutely, because a lot of people have ran off of our stuff of integrity, have ran off with our body integrity. Black women are raped and sexually assaulted more than any other group, with the exception of Native women. Why is Me Too started by Tawana Burke, a Black woman, right? When we think about the ways in which Black women are excised from fair housing and getting safe and healthy housing, to be in a neighborhood where you feel safe, to be able to exercise and feel comfortable. All these structural systemic problems Not to mention the fact that at any given point, you or your family might become a victim of state-sanctioned violence or police brutality. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm so angry by seeing everyone who is brutalized by the police then just becoming a hashtag upon a hashtag upon a hashtag. So there's so much that we have to be what Malcolm X talks about, righteous indignation. We have, I would change the word angry to we have righteous indignation. And we are entitled to that righteous indignation. We are entitled to feel that fury with a system that has in no ways supplied us with the oxygen that we need to survive, thrive, and live. As far as what it means to be authentic at work as a Black woman, this has been a journey for me throughout my career. But very early on, I think I made a choice that no matter what, I was going to show up as my true authentic self, because I was not going to allow you to define for me who I am. Because at the end of the day, I have to go to bed with me and wake up with me. So I think that there are definitely ramifications to that. There were true with me being an activist as a high school and college student. I lost certain scholarships that touted politics of respectability because I was not taking the slow and steady route of civil rights and human rights progression, right? So there are certainly consequences for that, but I also think that for us to live with who we are, which is the most important well that we must draw from for us, I think that being one's authentic self is the most radical act of self-love and resistance that you could ever proffer in a world that doesn't cite you, doesn't protect you, doesn't speak up for you, doesn't give you a lifeline. You create that space for yourself in yourself first before you go out to any of these workplaces and work worlds. And one more thing I wanted to say on that topic is this: there's this great book called You Are Your Best Thing, edited by Tawana Burke and Brene Brown. And it's talking about vulnerability, shame, resilience, and the Black experience. There's so much shame that Black women have been taught to hold, which in my opinion is a useless emotion. But we've been taught it from our churches. We've been taught it from our parents in some ways. We've been taught it from society around our emotional intelligence and our ability to sometimes be angry or not okay. And yet, if we think about it, we can resist that shame by fully embodying ourselves and being our true selves, not just at work, but at home, and understanding code switching and all of that. But I think that there's a space where we can find that middle ground where we can fully represent ourselves. Y'all see me, I'm showing up as my full self at any opportunity I get, because to be anything else would be unfair to me. And that's the person that I'm most concerned with this radical transformation healing with first, before I can do it for anyone else.
I absolutely love that. And speaking of resources, I'd like to hear from Liz. I'll tell you what, we're going to hear from Liz, and then we're going to take some questions from the Q&A, and then we're going to go right into just some guidance for organizations and allies, and then guidance for Black women on how to positively navigate this. But speaking of resources, Liz, you've written a book, I'm Not Yelling. So I would love to hear your answer to the question about our right to be angry and how we show up, but then also to talk a little bit about your book and, what drove you and led you to provide this guide to Black women on how to navigate under this, the weight of this stereotype.
Yeah, there's so much to be said, and I love this conversation. It's so rich, and I think I'm just listening and kind of just like taking in all the gems and the jewels, because this is really good to really just hear and get this affirmation. And I think that's really why I wrote I'm Not Yelling. It's a Black woman's guide to navigating the workplace. And when I started to write the book, I was like, let me give some strategies for how women can navigate and be more successful. The more I started to write, I really, it got to the heart of what we're talking about tonight, which is it really wasn't about tips, like how to get into the corner office. Because a lot of women were telling me they got into the C-suite and they were like, this sucks. Like, I don't even like the C-suite, right? And I was feeling the same thing. So I was like all like in favor of that. Like, you spend a lot of times, and both ladies have really well just dived into this idea that we hear guidance from our teachers and our mentors and our parents and everyone in the communities where we grow up that tells us, get your degree, get your internships, do the right thing, make sure you focus. And then a lot of times when we're going into these spaces, we're not getting paid what we're supposed to. We're seeing people come into the organization with nepotism or just because they're a culture fit, which means that they look like those that are in positions of power and influence, that we're not getting the accolades, we're not getting the pay, we're not getting the promotions. We're going into spaces where we're questioned, where we're challenged, where we're constantly having to validate ourselves. So yeah, that anger, if there is anger, that emotion, that frustration is real. And I think when I was writing the book, the reason why I wrote it in a way that was not like tips and strategies, 5 tips to get into the corner office, but more, let's dig into like who we are. Why are we so conflicted? What is it about our authentic, deep, true self that we don't feel safe enough to expose ourselves into when we're going into these predominantly white spaces? And for a lot of us, we're protecting ourselves. We know that these, our natural hair or the way that we speak or our confidence, all these things, we've dimmed our light because we see that it's not accepted. And I think a lot of what I talked about through the book and what I tell Black women that I've spoken with just as a part of advocacy and thinking about how to tell these stories is that we have to reclaim who we really are at our core. Because if you don't have that, it's almost like you don't have anything. Like they say, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. If you don't have who you really are at your core, it's almost like when we were growing up in the hood, and it was like, if you can't trust my word, you can't trust anything. And if I can't tell you the truth about myself, what does that say about me? And I started to think about that in my journey of advocacy. How can I advocate and say I'm speaking up for people and I'm not even being my real authentic self? It's like hypocritical for me to be saying I stand on the side of justice and truth, but I'm not even being honest with myself and who I am and how I feel. So I think it's important for us, if we're going into spaces, to just be who we are at our core. Some people say that's too risky. I have to code switch because if I don't code switch, they're going to think I'm not professional, or they're going to doubt me, or this is going to happen, or that is going to happen. And my thought process is, if you're going into that space and you're thinking that, you already have a target on your back. So you might as well just throw caution to the wind and be you. And they're going to have to accept it, deal with it, or not deal with it. I'm like, Tawana, I'm just like, I just boss up in every space I go into, and you just gonna have to deal with it. And just like Charnell, I will go on a call and I put my hair wrap on. I will do whatever, because at the end of the day, you still got to pay me a paycheck every 2 weeks, regardless of what I look like, regardless of what my earrings look like, regardless of what shade my lipstick is. I think for too long, we've been allowing that narrative to really hamper who we are. And my thing is, what's the worst that could happen? They tell you you can't work there anymore, and then I'm just gonna have to go get a job somewhere else. And that's probably what I need to do anyway. Because my thought process is, if you don't accept me in my full afro, and I think I also, and Charnell could probably relate to this, a lot of times I do to people what they're doing to me. So if I come on a Zoom with my afro picked out before I cut my hair into a low boy, and they're making a comment, I just stare at them the same way I stare at students in the classroom, because now I'm going to make you uncomfortable. You're saying something that's inappropriate, like, oh my God, Liz, your afro is it's so amazing. And then I'm like, thanks. And I just stare at them, because it's like I think a lot of times we're shamed by somebody doing something that's shameful. You're being inappropriate, unprofessional, yet I feel shame. No, now we both gonna feel uncomfortable. Because if you put me on the spot and do something that I feel is inappropriate, I treat you just like a student in my class. Now everybody gonna look at you and they're gonna laugh at you. And we're both gonna just stand here until somebody backs down. And if anybody know me from my classroom, that other person gonna back down before I do. Because I'm not gonna just let someone put me in a position where they feel like they have the ability to control the narrative about me. I read when I was writing a book about Sojourner Truth and Ain't I a Woman? And I think that put the nail in the coffin for me when I'm like, so we have this Ain't I a Woman speech, and you mean to tell me that this is like a plagiarized thing where people are literally putting words in our mouth and saying, this is what we said. A Dutch immigrant that didn't even speak with that accent, didn't speak like she came from the South. And people said, you know what we should do? Let's have her say, Ain't I a Woman? And I think that really brought home the idea that as Black women, historically, our words have been distorted. Our story has not been told accurately. And I make it a point when I guess we can pivot a little bit into strategy of whenever a microaggression, quote unquote, microaggression happens, or someone is not saying something accurately or portraying me in a way I don't like, I literally will stop, skirt everything. That's not what I said. And a lot of times people do get uncomfortable. People's faces get red. People start to stutter. I am uncomfortable. So now we're going to have a teachable moment. And even if it means that I'm targeted, quote unquote, my thought process is you already were targeting me because you had it in your mind that that was okay to do that. So already you're targeting me. You just haven't said it out loud or done anything to act on it. Now I see that. Now I'm going to make it a big deal every time. And I think when I saw that it worked was seeing a white older man that kept doing it to me, kept just everything I said, he had a counterpoint. And it started to get to the point where he was doing it. And every time he did it, I would call him out. And my boss, who was an older white woman, started to feel embarrassed. And she would step in and stop him. Because if we make it seem as though I think this behavior is okay, and we let behavior slide, it's almost akin to if someone made like a joke, like a sexual joke, or somebody made a joke that was something that was totally inappropriate about anything else. Why is it that I think we tend to give people a pass when it comes to these jokes about us, because we're scared that we're going to offend. But if someone made a comment that was gender based and something that was totally inappropriate, like women belong in the kitchen, everyone will call them out. So I think what we have to do is reframe the idea that us calling somebody out for bad behavior reflects badly on us. That's that person. And I had a boss that told me, oh, you need to stop doing that on the Zooms. I'm the victim of the situation. And that person was a Black woman. It's almost like go along to get along. Don't ruffle feathers. Let them say whatever. Just let it fall off your back. And my thought process is, even if not for myself, if I leave here, the next woman that comes in, I'm not going to allow that person to continue to think that that kind of behavior is okay and abuse people. So that individual that kept doing it to me, after a while, my boss just got sick of him, and she was on the verge of firing him, and he just quit. Because it's just like you have someone that's been allowed to be a bad actor. And if someone doesn't put a stop to this behavior, and us just empower ourselves to say, hey, can you not do that? That makes me uncomfortable. That takes 2 seconds, and now everybody's uncomfortable, but I was already uncomfortable. So I always feel as though it's important to check bad behavior. If I'm in the classroom, I don't allow students to misbehave. So I look at people in the C-suite, or people that are coworkers, or anyone that's in a work environment. If we're all supposed to be here and getting our work done, I can't function if you're doing things that are totally inappropriate. So I'm going to check it in that moment, and harmful and toxic and stressful. So I'm going to check it in that moment, and then let the chips fall where they may, because I'm already mad. So at that point, I don't really even care about the consequences, because that person's making my life miserable. And if that's happening, then that needs to be addressed in that moment. And then I can start looking for another job, or whatever the case may be in the meantime, because I realize that environment might not be an environment where I can thrive.
So one of the things that we've been talking about are the consequences for not showing up authentically. And I love that Tawana brought up the formula, because we've all been taught the formula to success. And it is deeply rooted in navigating the journey in white comfortability. And that's something that I've done previously in my career. And I will say that a piece of advice I can give is my mother always said, you start out like you want to finish. And one of the things that has happened to me in a previous opportunity is that I played the role to get the part. And so during the audition, during the interview phase, and I've talked to Tawana about this, I walked in and my hair was straightened, and I was meek, and I was humble, and I was soft-spoken, and I smiled and agreed, and I did all of the things that needed to be done to get in the position. And when you do that, you set the tone and stage for how then you will be regarded. And so in my experience in this opportunity, then I started to sit on Zooms, and they would forget that I was on the Zoom, to the point that they would begin to be their authentic selves, and to speak in their misogyny, and to speak in their racism, and to speak in their prejudice. And I'd be sitting on the Zoom, and when I began to call it out, or when I began to thwart against that behavior, then I became the angry Black woman. I became someone other than who they knew me to be, but that was my fault because that's how I had presented myself to be acceptable and to get the opportunity. And what I will say is, you all know I'm fairly new at Associated Black Charities, is for those of you navigating those spaces and prescribing to the formula, you don't know how soul crushing it is until you're not in it anymore. You don't even know how your psyche and your stress level and your health is being affected and all of these things until you have the opportunity to step out of it. And so there are deep consequences for Black women to not show up authentically from the beginning. And you're absolutely right in that if you aren't good enough to be in the space, then you really should protect yourself and not be in the space. I want to move on to a question from the viewers. This says, regarding the creation of the stereotype, what are your thoughts about the role of cross-cultural misunderstanding? Meaning that Black people tend to value direct, honest communication and permit emotion, whereas some white people prefer indirect, logical, and peacekeeping communication. So what do you feel about, the lack of cultural competence and engagement in, the existing of this stereotype?
For me, I feel like we learned everything about them. Somebody said this the other day, and I was like, this is so appropriate. We learned everything about them, but they didn't learn anything about us. And I think that is like some BS. Like, why am I required to understand that their communication is all around the corner? My boss does that. I ask her a direct question, and it's like, can I get an answer? Because you've said like 5 things and none of those are the answer to what I need. And with me, will tell her, like, my communication style, this is what I need to be successful. My communication is, I keep it very real. I just need you to give me direct answers, because my thought process too is, if you have a manager, that manager's job is not just to manage product, service, strategic planning or whatever. They're also there to nurture you and make sure that you are meeting your goals and you are successful as a part of their team. So I just feel like it's really important for me, when I'm navigating a space and someone is on my team, as well as the not people that I don't report to, because the people that they could all get it. If I don't report to you and you have nothing to do with me, then clearly I'm not obligated to, cater to you. But if I'm working with you, alongside you, or you're my manager, I feel like it's incumbent on me to go to my manager and say, this is the communication style that works for me. This is what I need in order to be successful. These are some of the things that I would need from you to support me. So I think for me, that has been an important part of making sure that direct and indirect, I have noticed that as well, as being, in higher education, as well as being in the corporate space, in the corporate suite, in the C-suite, where there seems to be almost like, if you're not saying things directly and being very evasive and vague, it's almost like rewarded. And being direct and being very frank and being honest is almost like you're a threat. If you're being honest, it's almost like they would prefer you not to be honest. And I usually will have a frank conversation with my boss and be like, do you want honesty? Do you want me to be direct? What communication style do you want? Because this is my communication style and this is what will make me successful. But I'm very upfront about how that's happening and why that's happening, so that it's not something where, oh my gosh, let me go back to my cube and think about it. I'm going to bring it to that person's attention and make sure that all of that's on the table.
Let me also, as we tee it over to Tawana, let me say, assuming that perhaps an ally asked that question, that I think it's also stereotypical that Black women and people communicate that way. I think that is not a zero-sum judgment of how Black people communicate. I think it is not cultural as much as it is due to lack of privilege. Black people don't have the privilege to be evasive and to not be direct, because we will be misinterpreted, misquoted, misunderstood. And so in a lot of situations, the direct and being honest in communication comes from the fact that we don't have the privilege to stand to be misinterpreted. And so I think that just, in thinking about the question, I don't think it is zero sum that all Black people are direct and communicate honestly. Tawana?
I was gonna say, not the ones that I coach. That's my first lesson I teach. I was gonna say a couple of things. I wrote this in the chat while Liz was talking, right? Which is you train people how to treat you. And I would also say that I found it interesting that when the question was posed, how, again, labeling, right? How Black people are this and do this, and how white people are seen as this and this. And I chuckled because I don't see white people as logical, and we're speaking in generalities right now, because of course they are, right? People who, or peacemakers by any means. Those were not the characteristics or adjectives that I would describe them to be. So I just found that in and of itself a chuckle. But to the question at hand, because it is real, and that is how they do see themselves, right? So as a result of that, they show up with a certain level of command. And when we're describing ourselves, we're showing up in a state of demanding, right? I gotta be direct and I gotta tell you like this, because we're demanding that we get this respect that should already be granted. So because it's not an even playing field, right? They will also translate the directness as in the form of temper tantrum, because I've heard it being described that way, right? You're demanding and you're so direct, and it's like you're forcing me to do this thing that you're saying that I'm supposed to do.
And the question is, what you have the audacity to show up that way, right?
Right.
Like you
Like,
have the
how dare
audacity
you?
to speak out. Yes.
Right. How dare you? Right? Because they see us in being this way as demanding of them, versus when they show up as logical peacemakers, as is being described here, that they're coming from a command, which speaks to their privilege,
It
right?
does.
Which speaks to that they have the space and place to be this way.
Yes,
And
indeed.
so we find ourselves constantly countering the power, the authority, the privilege, right? And so my thing is, you train people how to treat you. So I love what Liz was saying, because it speaks to, I'm going to correct bad behavior when it comes into my space, because I am retraining how to treat me. And I'm hoping that this behavior that I'm showing up in this space is role modeling for others, and as well as giving them an opportunity to rethink what is seemingly natural to them.
Right.
And I would always
Right.
say, no, how I'm showing up is my natural self. I heard something that I disagree with, and so I'm checking it. And I'm not making it a general statement. I'm talking directly to you, Bob. Right? Oh, well, when I talk to Chrissy, I'm not Chrissy. And that's not our relationship. And that's not how I choose to have an exchange with you.
Mhm.
And my
So
response is, you're direct, you're this, you're that.
it really comes down to us staying in our place, right?
Correct.
Where there's an expectation that we stay in our place. And Charnell, I know you want to contribute, but I'm going to ask that you roll your comments also into this next question, which I'll leave to you, which is, how can you tell when the feedback you received is actually based in the stereotype versus legitimately speaking to areas where you need growth professionally? How do you differentiate if you're being classified as angry, or do you really, perhaps need professional development as a Black woman in the workplace? Charnell?
Yeah, there's some really great studies that have come out in the last 10 years or so, specifically looking at Black women professors compared to their white counterparts in other groups. And what the study showed, this was coming out of Harvard as well as the University of Chicago, what they showed longitudinally is that the way that students respond to Black women professors the evaluations that come back, and I'm sure that Elizabeth can attest to this, the evaluations that come back are loaded in racialized and gendered stereotype language compared to white male counterparts or even other groups of people of color, such as Asian Americans or Latinx folks. We tend to get the attitudinal, sort of man-hating comments, et cetera, et cetera. And what that speaks to, I think, I use that as an example just to say that there is true articulation by the populations that we work with and serve, if we're educators, if we're community organizers, that they have these particular stereotypes even in the evaluation of our work. And I think that when we see these things, so I remember having a conversation with some Black women who worked in academia as well as in the community organizing space and sort of taking our feedback and pulling it apart. I think that it's important for us to say, yeah, it's really interesting that the feedback that Susan got was that she needed to give more facts in her presentation and that she needed to speak up, for example. She was speaking too low. But the feedback that I got was that it seemed to be aggressive and it made me feel offended. That isn't feedback that is actually helpful to my growth. So I think I know this is a very minutia detail, it might seem, but language is so important. Language can be a tool of liberation. It can be a tool of colonialism. It can be a tool of healing. And I think the language that we use in our evaluations or feedback that we get from other people, it's okay to say, I'm really interested as a Black woman in my professional development and growth. And this feedback is more so speaking to my character and not my professionalism.
Yes.
So I would like to actually have a conversation with you about my professional goals. I've always kind of flipped it on its head. If I get a bad evaluation from a student, or when I say bad, I mean, again, racial and gendered stereotype type of evaluation is never based on my intellectual capacity or my ability to facilitate the space. If I've done workshops publicly through my consulting business or other organizations that I've worked with, if the feedback comes back that way, what I'll say to the person who's my superior is, hey, listen, I am actually interested in my professional growth. Here are my professional goals. And this is the feedback that I need within this framework. However, this feedback, again, is speaking to a characterization that I don't ascribe to, and it's not helpful to me helping to get to my professional goals. So I think when you frame it very directly, this is what I want to do. This is how I want to elevate, move, grow. And this is how you can assist me in that journey, rather than giving me racial and gendered stereotype evaluation and feedback. That can be the differentiation of the two, because there's a huge difference between character and professional feedback.
Absolutely. So what I want to do is I'm going to run through really quickly what allies and organizations can do to acknowledge that this stereotype negatively impacts Black women. But I want us to wrap up on giving tools and encouragement to Black women on navigating the angry Black woman stereotype. So really quickly, organizations, allies, acknowledge the problem exists. Hopefully hearing from 4 Black women who've navigated the workplace and others in the chat and others, probably if you asked in your personal connections, you will hear that the angry Black woman stereotype exists. It's a thing, it's harmful. And so if you are interested in helping Black women overcome the negative effects of it in the workplace, we ask that you acknowledge the problem exists, that you educate yourself, specifically on the Black woman's lived experience, that you check yourself as an individual and as an organization. You check your unconscious bias and how you are visualizing who the Black woman is in the workplace and the role she plays in your workforce, that you're empathetic, that you understand that this is part of our lived experience. This is not just a conversation. So we wake up tomorrow and this is part of what we navigate on a daily basis. And then lastly, you take a stand. Whether your organization will take one holistically or you will individually as a human who has humanity and cares about other people, that you take a stand and you speak up when you see these things manifesting in your workplace, in your life, in other areas and spaces. And so we're hopeful that our allies and organizations will take that guidance. But we'll close today talking about what Black women can do to navigate this reality at work. And I'll go through the panel and ask that you keep your remarks brief so we can be respectful of time. Tawana, starting with you, what can Black women do to navigate this reality at work?
Assess if this environment is conducive for you. If it is out of alignment, head and heart, you should look for your next best assignment where you feel that you can grow, flourish, and fit in. And the fit in is not because you are assimilating. The fit in is because this is a space and place where you believe you can bring your authentic self. I will no longer coach Black women to navigate these waters in a way that will have them to be able to overcome, push through, striving. If you don't believe that you can thrive in this space by bringing your authentic self, then this space is not the space for you.
Amen. Thank you. And Charnell?
Oof, I'm just feeling good. Chills. I feel like this has been a beautiful healing space in so many ways. The words, thank you to my panelists for everything that you all have offered. I guess what I want to suggest is make sure that you're in deep solidarity and camaraderie with all Black women. And I want to just raise that, we talk a lot about within our internal communities of Black communities, we talk about what Black women are experiencing, the angry Black women. We can't forget that Black trans women are experiencing these issues magnified times 1,000, and Black trans women are Black women, right? And so I think that when we hear these negative stereotypes about Black women and women in general, that Black women don't get along with each other, that certain shades of Black women don't like other shades of Black women, that trans women and cis women don't get along, or that they're in competition with one another. When we stand in solidarity and uplift our sisters, uplift the work of Black trans women like Angelica Ross and Ash Williams, uplift the work of Black cis women like the Say Her Name Coalition that's out in Baltimore, and stand in solidarity with each other and resist those patriarchal and racist stereotypes, that we cannot be in solidarity with one another and support each other in these workspaces, as well as our entrepreneurial spaces, then we've created a whole new narrative that really takes down all of these things that have been said against us. And so that would be something I would suggest. I don't think I've gotten anywhere without the regular conversations with my best girlfriends and friends who are people of color that have helped me through navigating the workspace and finding that niche of cisgender folk, Black women, femmes, non-binary folks that can support you in this movement and in the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for that. And Liz?
I echo everything. I think I definitely have come a long way in the past 2 years, and a lot of that has come from community of the women that I've met, the women I've connected with, women that, I grew just from growing up in a strong community of Black women, being in solidarity with women. I think that's another trope, that Black women don't get along, or Black women don't support each other. We can see a Black woman at the grocery store and be like, girl, are you working at those heels? It's something in our nature that we love to uplift each other. So I feel as though finding that community of support is really important. Having other women that you can bounce things off and just be like, does this make sense to you? And having someone say, oh, I went through that same thing. Even just being in this space and having this affirmation and hearing that other people have been through something similar, it gives me, that strength. So just being able to do that and share stories so that we know that our experiences are not unique, and that we have, I think, definitely the will and the ability to decide if a space is conducive to us. And I really agree with what Tawana said as well, this idea that not every space is for us, not every space needs to be for us. Every space doesn't deserve us. And I think that was one of the things that came out when I did the book, was I interviewed Madison Butler, who's pretty prolific on LinkedIn platform as well as TikTok. And that was one of the things that she talks about as an advocate for both Black women and for queer women, and just being very vocal about, taking a stance in all of our identities and all of our rich beauty and everything that we bring. Sometimes the space does not deserve our presence, and sometimes the space is not conducive to us, and sometimes we cannot grow there. So I think sometimes another woman that I interviewed for the book, Kanika Tolver, she wrote a book on career growth and aspiration. But one of the things she talks about for Black women is just to be not necessarily looking at every job as a husband. We have to have friends with benefits and look at a job as, this might be just something that you can get for now and move on to the next opportunity. And I think just to I guess, finish off with my thought is just also to pull on the strength that comes from us internally. And I think we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We have our ancestral roots and our tradition, and everything that makes us so amazingly unique is already inside us. So just leaning into the power of ourselves and our voices and everything that we bring to the table and all of our rich, amazing beauty and authenticity, that's probably the biggest piece of advice that has helped me, is just to be my real, true, raw, authentic self.
Thank you so much. I want to take the time to thank our panelists for being with us this evening for this robust and much needed conversation. This Equity at Work series is meant all year long to help Black people navigate obstacles created by structural racism, obstacles in the workplace. And we are happy to bring this to you as part of ABC's mission to support our community. In February, on the last Tuesday of the month, February 28th, you will be joined by Charnell Covert as moderator as we look at the intersection of social justice and being Black in the workplace with our next webinar, Working While Woke. Thank you for joining Associated Black Charities. I am Chrissy Thornton, and we appreciate you, and we will see you soon. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.